The rain came down in sheets, relentless and cold, turning the city's sidewalks into reflective rivers of light and shadow. Elijah Cole stepped out of his matte black SUV and pulled the hood of his faded sweatshirt over his head. No one would have guessed the man ducking beneath the awning of Cole & King's, Atlanta's most prestigious high-end menswear boutique, was its billionaire founder. His beard was untrimmed, his jeans worn at the knees, and his sneakers bore the scuffs of a man who'd walked more than his share of city blocks. That was by design. Today was not about being recognized. The glass doors parted with a hiss, and the warm glow of curated spotlights greeted him. Inside, the scent of sandalwood and citrus floated through the air, a scent he'd personally chosen during the store's design phase. The white marble floors gleamed, the racks spaced meticulously apart, each holding tailored pieces worth hundreds, if not thousands. Everything screamed excellence, but the energy inside felt brittle. At the front desk stood a tall woman with coffee-toned skin, a sleek bun, and sharp cheekbones that gave her a regal air. Her name tag read, Hallie. She didn't look up from her phone as he approached. "We're not hiring," she said without missing a beat, her tone bored, her eyes still scanning the screen. Elijah blinked. "Excuse me?" he asked, voice low, neutral. Hallie finally glanced at him, her eyes sweeping over his rain-drenched hoodie, frayed cuffs, and water-spotted jeans. "Whatever you're looking for, we don't have it. Try downtown." Then she returned to her screen like he was background noise. A slow heat crawled up Elijah's neck, not from anger, but from disbelief. He glanced around. No other customers. No one else to distract her. "I'm looking for the Ainsley Italian wool trench," he said calmly. "Black. Size 44. Your online inventory says you have 2 in stock." She sighed. A long theatrical sigh. "Sir," she said, not even trying to mask her irritation, "that coat costs over $2,000. Do you even have an appointment?" Her gaze held a quiet sneer, the kind sharpened over time, forged by judgments both given and received. Elijah paused. He studied her, not just the way she stood like she ran the place, but the weariness behind her eyes. Still, it didn't excuse her. "No appointment," he said. "Just thought I'd walk in." "Then walk out," she muttered, already moving toward the back room. "We don't entertain browsers in the VIP section. You need a referral to even try it on." She disappeared behind a velvet curtain, leaving Elijah standing in the middle of his own empire, humiliated. He looked around, at the displays he'd approved, the wall art he'd sourced from local artists, the entire aesthetic he'd curated to feel inclusive, personal, elevated. And yet, the person running his front desk had greeted him like he was dirt tracked in from the street. Elijah turned and walked out slowly, the weight of her dismissal sinking deeper with each step. The rain hadn't let up. It lashed against his hood like 1,000 tiny fists, but it couldn't drown out the sting in his chest. He wasn't angry because she didn't recognize him. He'd deliberately come incognito. No, what cut deepest was her attitude. The cold, casual way she'd discarded him. It made him wonder, if this is how she treats strangers, how many others had walked out of his store feeling small? How many sales had been lost, reputations damaged, or loyal customers alienated? By the time he slid behind the wheel of his SUV, his hands were tight on the steering wheel, jaw clenched. The windshield wipers beat rhythmically against the glass, but the storm inside him was louder. This store was one of his flagship locations, a model for the entire chain. He'd named it after his grandfather and his mentor. It wasn't just a business, it was legacy. And something had rotted beneath the surface. He took a long breath and started the engine. No matter how expensive the glass, a cracked foundation would crumble eventually. Halle Berry had made a mistake, one he wouldn't forget. But firing her outright? That would be too easy. No, Elijah had always believed in precision. You didn't fix a problem by trimming the leaves. You dug up the roots. And this root went deeper than one rude employee. This was personal. This was systemic. And starting tomorrow, Elijah Cole was going undercover. Not as the CEO. Not as a customer. But as someone no one would ever expect. The janitor. The ghost in the walls. He drove off into the storm, heart pounding, not with rage, but with resolve. Because poetic justice wasn't served hot or cold. It was served with strategy. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse overlooking the city, lights twinkling through the glass like distant promises. The encounter with Hallie played in his mind on repeat, The deadpan dismissal, the way she didn't even glance at him fully before making her judgment. It wasn't the arrogance that bothered him most. It was the efficiency of it. She'd dismissed him with surgical precision, like she'd done it 100 times before. And maybe she had. By morning, he was already combing through her file. His assistant, Yvette, delivered it without question. She didn't need to know why. Elijah had always been an enigma at the helm of Cole & King's. Intensely private, always 10 steps ahead. Still, even Yvette raised an eyebrow when she handed him the folder, slim and meticulous, like everything Halle Berry touched. Top performer, Yvette noted. No complaints on record. Actually quite the opposite. Corporates flagged her twice for potential advancement. Her numbers are strong. Upselling, customer satisfaction, employee leadership scores, all top tier. Elijah didn't respond. He just flipped the folder open and read. Bachelor's degree in business. Former intern at Merrill Lynch. Moved to retail after a family emergency in 2020. Hired into Cole & King's as a floor associate, quickly promoted to assistant lead. Commendations from district managers. Letters from satisfied clients. And yet, last night, none of that woman existed. The Halle Berry he'd encountered hadn't just been dismissive. She'd been hardened. Cold. He pulled the surveillance feed from the store. The footage was clear, 4K resolution, audio enabled. He watched as Halle greeted an older white couple with a flawless smile, offering bottled water and a personal tour of the collection. She floated through the space like she owned it. And then the manager walked in, a heavy-set man named Brad Ellis, and everything changed. Halle's posture stiffened. Her expression morphed into corporate neutrality. And then later in the day, as the store emptied out, she slumped into the front desk chair and scrolled her phone dead-eyed. No smile. No presence. Just survival. He rewound the tape to the exact moment he walked in. It was all there, the glance, the dismissal, the way she turned her back before he even finished speaking. But something flickered in her face, just for a moment. Was it exhaustion? Disdain? Fear? Whatever it was, it stuck with him. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the entire culture he'd allowed to fester. Managers ignoring behavior. Employees weaponizing assumptions. He thought he'd built an empire of elegance and accessibility. But beneath the polished exterior, something had grown toxic. If Halle was the face of that dysfunction, it was because the foundation permitted it. That's when the idea struck. He wouldn't just walk in again as himself. No press release. No staff memo. Instead, he'd apply as a night janitor, third-party contractor, through a cleaning agency his company already used. He'd work the closing shift. Invisible. Overlooked. The same way Halle had tried to overlook him. The irony made him smirk. If she was going to teach him what was wrong with his store, he was going to let her. Up close. Quietly. Intimately. That afternoon, he put in a call to George Redding, the owner of a janitorial service Elijah's company had on retainer. Got someone new I need on site, Elijah said. Use a fake name. Put him in your system. All paperwork will be handled through my office. George chuckled. Let me guess, another one of your undercover boss stunts. Something like that, Elijah said. By the end of the day, Elijah Cole was officially employed as Eli King, night janitor assigned to the Midtown Cole & King's location. No one would recognize him, not with the beard unshaven, the hoodie pulled low, the quiet shuffle of a man who didn't speak unless spoken to. And this time, when he walked into the store, it would be through the back entrance. He showed up that night just before 10 p.m., pushing a cart full of supplies and wearing gloves 2 sizes too big. The store was closed to the public, but employees lingered, closing tills, organizing stock. Halle was still there, arguing with Brad over inventory counts. She's always here late, one of the other cleaners muttered, nodding toward her. Something to prove, I guess. Elijah didn't respond. He just watched her in silence. Same sharp walk. Same tense shoulders. But she wasn't cold now. She was meticulous. Focused. And when Brad finally stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Halle sat alone in the fitting room, staring at her reflection like it was a stranger. He moved quietly past her, mop in hand. She didn't see him. Didn't even register his presence. Perfect. She wouldn't know who he was. Not yet. But he'd be watching. Listening. Learning. Because if there was rot in his kingdom, he was going to root it out. And she'd either be part of the solution, or the first piece he'd remove. Halle's alarm buzzed at 6:03 a.m. sharp. She didn't snooze. She never did. The habit had been trained into her ever since life stopped offering cushions. Her son, Amir, was still asleep in the next room, tangled in superhero bedsheets, one leg dangling off the edge. She watched him for a few seconds, her chest tightening with both love and the familiar ache of responsibility. At just 7, he had no idea how much of the world's weight she carried to make sure he never had to. She dressed quickly, plain black slacks, low heels, and a button-up blouse she'd ironed the night before. There were no designer pieces in her wardrobe, despite working at a store that dripped with luxury. Everything she owned was clean, pressed, and forgettable. It was safer that way. Blend in, get through the day, get paid. Repeat. Every hour at Cole & King's was accounted for, every second calculated. From the moment she clocked in, she was on guard. Her manager, Brad, had a habit of singling her out, subtle digs, unfair schedule changes, passive-aggressive. Comments about her tone. If she ever snapped, he'd write her up. But if she swallowed it, she survived. 3 years ago, Hallie had been on the fast track to a career in finance. She'd landed an internship at Merrill Lynch, impressed the senior managers, and was on the verge of a job offer. Then her mother had collapsed at work, a stroke. Hallie quit everything, came home to Atlanta, and took the first job she could find. When her mom passed 6 months later, it was already too late to claw back the path she'd left behind. Now she worked 12-hour shifts, dodged judgmental stares, and tried not to let the bitterness rot her from the inside out. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. The problem with Cole & King's, she'd learned, wasn't the clothes or the clientele. It was the illusion. The pretense of refinement cloaked a hierarchy built on subtle cruelty. Brad promoted women who flirted, overlooked ones who didn't. Black employees got stuck on the sales floor. White ones moved into corporate. And if you complained, well, you weren't a cultural fit. So when the man in the hoodie had walked in, soaked and quiet, Hallie had followed instinct. Protect yourself. Filter the situation. Avoid risk. She hadn't recognized him. She'd barely looked at him. But that moment was already behind her. She had no idea the man she'd dismissed now swept the very floors beneath her. Elijah, Eli for now, watched her that night from behind a shelf of folded wool trousers. He pushed his mop slowly, deliberately, careful not to draw attention. The other staff had begun to treat him like furniture, present but invisible. That suited him perfectly. He watched Hallie carry a stack of customer returns into the back, her movements precise, efficient. She didn't make small talk. She didn't gossip like the others. She worked like someone who couldn't afford not to. Later that night, Elijah overheard a conversation between Brad and another manager in the stockroom. "She's got an attitude problem," Brad said, voice low, conspiratorial. "Thinks she knows more than everyone. I've been documenting it. Next mess up, she's out. You'll see." The other manager grunted. "But she does know more than everyone. That's why customers like her." "Doesn't matter," Brad snapped. "She's replaceable." Elijah clenched his jaw. So it was personal. Hallie wasn't just cold to customers, she was under siege herself. But even so, she'd become part of the same machine. She'd written him off with the same prejudice Brad used on her. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back at home, he pulled up more footage from the past week. Hallie helping an elderly man find shoes that fit his diabetic feet. Hallie calming down a woman whose order had been lost. Hallie staying 2 hours after closing because a junior associate had messed up the till. This woman wasn't a problem. She was the glue holding the place together. Still, something in her had hardened, something that turned kindness into calculation. Elijah recognized it because he'd lived it. When you climb out of poverty and into power, you learn to wield control like a weapon. But where he'd gained grace, she'd grown walls. The deeper he looked, the more contradictions emerged. Employees feared Brad but respected Hallie. Customers adored her but were rarely referred to her directly. She'd created a personal brand inside a broken system, but one misstep and it could all come crashing down. Elijah knew he couldn't confront her yet, not until he understood the full picture. Because something told him Halle Berry wasn't just reacting to the environment, she was hiding something inside it. And if she was playing a game, she wasn't playing to win. She was playing not to lose. But Elijah didn't believe in just survival. He believed in justice. And hers was coming, one way or another. The next week passed in fragments of observation and revelation. Elijah, still posing as Eli the janitor, became a ghost in the system, watching, absorbing, documenting everything. By day, he reviewed store metrics and employee records from his corporate penthouse. By night, he pushed a mop across marble floors and studied the cracks in his empire. It didn't take long to see that the rot ran deeper than he feared. Brad, the manager, ruled the store through intimidation and petty politics. He targeted employees with underhanded remarks and took credit for their accomplishments. New hires barely lasted 3 weeks under his supervision, and turnover in this location was twice the company average. Yet somehow his reports painted him as a model leader, thanks to falsified surveys, staged performance reviews, and his uncanny ability to blame others for every shortfall. Hallie, meanwhile, navigated this minefield like a dancer in a war zone. She knew every SKU by heart, anticipated difficult customers before they even spoke, and filled in for co-workers who called out without complaint. But she'd grown sharp-edged, clipped, like someone who'd been burned too many times and now carried the torch just in case she needed to defend herself. Elijah observed the tension between her and Brad with growing unease. One night, after closing, he caught the tail end of another confrontation in the stockroom. "You didn't process the Hamilton order correctly," Brad barked. "Again?" "That's impossible," Hallie replied, her voice steady but cold. "I triple-checked the entries. The system's inventory tracker has been glitching. I already reported it to IT." Brad scoffed. "Always an excuse. Maybe you're not as indispensable as you think." "I don't think I am," she shot back. "But I am right." Elijah stood around the corner, his mop idle, pretending to focus on a smudge along the baseboard. His ears sharpened. There was venom in Brad's tone. But also something else, resentment? Fear? After Brad left, Hallie slumped briefly against the wall, exhaling through her nose like someone training herself not to cry. Then just as quickly she straightened, adjusted her shirt, and walked back onto the floor like nothing had happened. That resilience stirred something in Elijah. It was familiar. The armor people like them had to wear just to function in a world that never expected them to succeed. But even armor cracks under enough pressure. The breaking point came 2 nights later. It started as an ordinary evening. Elijah was in the back, sorting trash bags, when he heard Hallie's voice rising in the front showroom. "Sir, I understand your frustration," she was saying, calm but firm, "but threatening me isn't going to change the return policy." Elijah moved closer. A man in a pinstripe suit towered over Hallie, red-faced and snarling. "Do you know who I am? I spend more money in this store every month than you probably make in a year." "I'm sure you do," she replied evenly, "but the return window is 15 days. You purchased this jacket 6 weeks ago. It's worn and altered. I can't accept it." The man leaned in too close. "Where's your manager? Or do you think because you're wearing a name tag, you've got authority?" "I am the authority tonight," she said. "Our policy is not negotiable." Elijah stepped forward without thinking. "Is there a problem here, sir?" The man turned, eyes narrowing at the janitor who dared to speak. "Stay in your lane, maintenance man." But Hallie's eyes locked on Elijah, startled. Not because he'd intervened, but because she saw something in his stance, calm, controlled, powerful. He wasn't just another background figure. He exuded quiet command. "I've got this," she said quickly, but her voice faltered for the first time. The customer stormed out moments later, muttering threats about calling corporate. Later, as Hallie walked past Elijah in the break room, she paused. "Thanks," she said softly. Then, after a beat, "You don't talk much." "Nothing worth saying," Elijah replied. "Not yet." She stared at him for a long second. Something shifted in her gaze, curiosity maybe, suspicion. But she said nothing else and walked away. That night, Elijah sat in his car long after his shift ended, rain ticking against the windshield like it had the night she dismissed him. Except now the narrative had flipped. She wasn't the villain. She was a product of survival. She didn't need punishment. She needed protection from the system, from Brad, and maybe, if he could manage it without shattering her pride, from herself. But one thing gnawed at him still. Why hadn't she recognized him? His face was in internal press releases. His portrait hung in corporate HQ. Every employee received a welcome packet with his biography. But Hallie hadn't flinched, hadn't stumbled, hadn't hesitated. She truly had no idea who he was. Unless she did, and she was pretending not to. Either way, the truth was coming. And when it did, everything would change. By the 5th week, the pressure had crystallized. Elijah had spent nearly a month cleaning his own store, crawling through its underbelly, watching the people who powered it, and those who poisoned it. Each night layered new truths atop old assumptions. Cole & King's was profitable, yes. Polished, yes. But beneath the gold leaf branding and high-end fabric, it was hollowing from the inside out. He hadn't revealed himself yet. Not to Hallie. Not to Brad. Not to anyone. But the moment of reckoning crept closer with each shift. It stirred in his chest like a clock ticking toward detonation. All it needed was a spark. That spark came unexpectedly on a Friday night. Hallie stayed late, as usual, closing registers and organizing the new window display. Her son had been sick earlier in the week, and she'd taken 2 unpaid days to stay home with him, something Brad hadn't let go unmentioned. "You're replaceable, Barry," he'd sneered that morning. "Single mom or not, attendance matters." She didn't flinch in front of him. But in the break room later, Elijah had watched her quietly press her palms to her face, breathing hard, trying not to break. He didn't speak. Not then. He just took out the trash and walked past her like any other shadow. But that night, around 10:45 p.m., a storm knocked out the power in Midtown. The store went black, emergency lights flickering along the baseboards. In the confusion, someone tripped the rear security door, and a piercing alarm rang through the entire building. Elijah rushed toward the back hallway, heart hammering. That's when he saw him. Brad. Hands buried in the safe drawer, stuffing envelopes into his bag. Thousands in cash. Unauthorized withdrawals. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Elijah's voice cut the dark like a blade. Brad froze, spinning around. His eyes narrowed at Elijah. "You," he scoffed. "You're a janitor. You didn't see anything." Elijah stepped forward, calm. "You know stealing from the store carries felony charges, right? Doesn't matter who you think I am." Brad laughed, but it was shaky. "You don't know anything. Mind your mop, man. Walk away." "No," came another voice, sharp, defiant. "Hallie." She stood in the doorway, a box of display jewelry still in her arms. She'd seen everything. Brad's face paled. "You set me up," he spat, looking between them. "The both of you." Elijah tilted his head, almost pitying him. "You set yourself up. We just witnessed the truth." "Don't do this," Brad hissed to Hallie. "If you report this, you'll go down too. You've been insubordinate for months. One word from me, and HR will eat you alive. You think you're safe?" Hallie stared at him for a long, chilling second. Then she opened the box in her hands and held up her phone. "Recording. Everything." "I'm done being afraid," she said. Security arrived 6 minutes later. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the truth had already torn through the store like lightning. Brad was escorted out in handcuffs. Hallie stood frozen in place, shaking, but her chin high. Elijah watched it unfold quietly. His heart beat loud in his ears, not with fear, but with admiration. She hadn't needed his protection after all. She'd found her voice, even when everything inside her had been conditioned to stay silent. After the commotion died down, she found him in the break room, sitting on a stool like any other night. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Elijah looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, let the truth show in his eyes. "I'm Elijah Cole," he said. "Founder. CEO." She didn't blink. Just stood there. "No," she whispered. "Yes," he confirmed. "And you're the reason I came here." Her breath caught. "Because I refused to help you?" "Because you exposed what I refused to see," he said. "I created a brand that promised excellence. You showed me what happens when that promise rots under the wrong leadership." Hallie looked away, stunned. "I thought you were just some guy who needed directions." "I was," Elijah said. "And you were someone who thought no one was watching. But I was. And I see you now, Hallie. All of you." She sank into a chair across from him, speechless. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full of revelation, of exhaustion, of the quiet hum of change. "Is this where you fire me?" she asked, half a laugh, half a dare. He shook his head. "This is where I promote you." 2 weeks later, the store no longer felt like the same place. Gone were the brittle silences, the snide remarks, the constant undercurrent of fear that used to follow Hallie through every aisle. The staff had shifted too, walking taller, speaking louder, no longer tiptoeing around Brad's temper. His removal had been swift, but the echo of his toxicity took longer to fade. Still, change had arrived, and it wore a quiet confidence in the form of Hallie Berry. Elijah hadn't just promoted her. He'd restructured the entire leadership of the store around her. Officially, she was now the assistant regional manager, with full oversight of Cole and King's Midtown, and 2 additional Atlanta branches. Unofficially, she was the storm that had cleared the rot and rebuilt the structure. Not everyone adjusted smoothly. Some employees bristled at the idea of a black woman rising so quickly. Others felt threatened by her authority. But Hallie didn't flinch anymore. She had been forged in pressure, and now, she moved with the gravity of someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to uphold. She thought often about Elijah. Even now, she wasn't sure whether she was more shocked by his deception, or by how gracefully he had carried it. He'd returned to corporate headquarters the morning after Brad's arrest, sending her only a short message before disappearing behind executive walls again. Underscore, you were always the most valuable person in that store. Now it's time the system saw it too. Underscore, no apologies. No long explanations. Just acknowledgement. Still, something in her felt unfinished. It was Friday when the email came, an invitation to a private dinner at the top floor of the Monarch Hotel, signed by Elijah himself. She hesitated before replying. Was this about business? A debrief? Or something more? Either way, she owed it to herself to find out. That night, Hallie arrived in a charcoal gray dress that whispered elegance without trying. She hadn't worn anything like it since her finance days, before diapers and debt, before chasing buses and second jobs. Her heels clicked softly against the marble lobby floor as she entered the elevator and rode it up, heart pulsing like a live wire. When the doors opened, Elijah was already waiting, dressed in a dark navy suit with the collar slightly unbuttoned. The city skyline glowed behind him, and for a second, she forgot every role they'd played, janitor and associate, CEO and subordinate. They were just two people standing in the silence between transformation and truth. You look different, he said, a quiet smile on his face. So do you, she replied. They sat by the window, dinner served but mostly ignored. Conversation flowed easier than she expected. He told her about his beginnings. Raised by a single mother in Savannah, built the company from the trunk of his car, swore he'd never forget the feeling of being overlooked. She told him about Amir, her late mother, the internship she gave up, and the dreams she shelved to keep a roof over their heads. Why didn't you say something that night? She finally asked, looking at him. When I brushed you off. I wanted to see how far the damage went, he said. And I needed to know who my people really were. You mean who bowed and who stood their ground? Exactly. She took a slow sip of wine. And what did you see in me? Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. I saw someone surviving a system built to break her, he said. But more than that, I saw someone who never let it dim her light completely. You might have looked away from me that night, but you didn't look away from everyone. You still showed up, even when they tried to bury you. Her throat tightened. For years, she had worked without recognition, without safety, without assurance that anything she did mattered. And now, here was the man who built the empire telling her she was the foundation. Do you believe in second chances? She asked quietly. I believe in earned ones, Elijah said. And you've earned more than a second chance. You've earned a seat at the table. Outside, the skyline shimmered with movement, cars weaving, lights blinking, lives unfolding across windows. But up here it was quiet. Safe. True. For the first time in years, Hallie didn't feel like she was running. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't proving. She was seen. Elijah stood, walked over to the bar, and poured 2 glasses of champagne. To justice, he said, lifting his glass. She met his gaze. Steady. Sure. To change, she replied. And together they drank, 2 stories finally colliding in the place where power met purpose. 3 months passed, and the world moved on. But inside the walls of Cole and King's, a quiet revolution had begun. Midtown was no longer just a flagship store. It had become a model of resilience, reform, and redemption. Halle Berry's name had started to echo in the higher circles of leadership, not as a token promotion, but as a symbol of earned power. She didn't just run a store, she transformed its culture. The corporate board had taken notice. Elijah made sure of that. She now sat in meetings with executives who once ignored her emails, now hanging on every word she spoke. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when she did speak, people listened. Her insights came from the floor, from real shifts, real customers, and the very real challenges of single parenthood and systemic oversight. She had been underestimated, underpaid, and overlooked. But not anymore. Still, power wasn't the reward. Purpose was. She used her new influence to implement changes that mattered. Flexible scheduling for working parents, a formal grievance pipeline for employee mistreatment, and real-time auditing to prevent abuse from middle management. The Halle Berry Initiative, they called it. She hated the name, but she loved the fire it sparked. Elijah stayed behind the scenes for most of it. He made no grand speeches or press appearances. but his influence was felt in every new policy rolled out and every budget restructured. Their late-night conversations had become more frequent, sometimes over reports, sometimes over wine, sometimes over shared silence. There was no label to what they were building, but it was real, and it was theirs. One Thursday morning, Hallie walked into her old store, not as an associate, not even as a regional manager, but as a partner. The moment she entered, the staff straightened with pride, not because they feared her, but because they respected her. Her journey was their mirror, and her presence was proof that survival could become success. "Morning, boss," said Carmen, the youngest cashier, who used to flinch every time Brad walked by. "Morning, Carmen," Hallie replied, handing her a cup of her favorite chai. "How's school?" "Passed my midterms," she beamed. "Of course you did," Hallie said, and meant it. She made her way to the back, checking in on stock logs, supply orders, and floor operations. But something tugged at her. A gut feeling, unsettled but sharp. She stopped at the employee notice board. A single sheet of paper caught her eye. Internal complaint status, closed. Under it, in bold letters, read a name she recognized, Janelle Whitman. One of the new hires from a nearby branch. Quiet. Bright. Had the same look in her eyes Hallie once did, like she was still figuring out how to belong. She marched straight to the office and pulled up Janelle's file. 2 complaints. Both closed in under 24 hours. No follow-up. No HR interview. Just dismissed. Before I go on, I know you are enjoying the story, so I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, smash the subscribe button down below, and turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. Alright, let's continue. A flicker of old rage lit in her chest. Elijah picked up her call on the second ring. "That was fast," he said. "Janelle Whitman. Midtown East." Her complaints were buried. "By whom?" "Same name on the override, Derek Langston. Area manager." A pause. Then Elijah's voice, low and sharp. He was Brad's mentor. Of course he was. "Pull the files," she said. "I want everything." That evening, she met Elijah in the boardroom. No city view. No candlelit dinner. Just facts spread across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Janelle's voice cracked through the room, an audio file she'd recorded in fear, detailing inappropriate conduct and thinly veiled threats. "She's 23, Hallie said. "One more incident like that and she leaves. Another one gone." "Unless we make an example," Elijah said. The next morning, Derek Langston was suspended pending investigation. By nightfall, he was fired. No settlements. No cover-up. Just accountability. Hallie personally called Janelle. Told her she mattered. That someone had finally listened. And as she hung up, a strange peace settled over her. Not the calm that comes after silence, but the satisfaction of noise finally being used for something good. That weekend, she and Elijah stood at the opening of the newest Cole and King's branch. This one in Savannah, his hometown. She looked at the store, bustling with staff from all walks of life. Some fresh from shelters, others mothers like her, all of them seen. "You ever think this would be your life?" Elijah asked, half smiling. She laughed, low and honest. "I used to dream about surviving the day. That was it. And now, she said, I build dreams I never thought I deserved." He reached for her hand. No fanfare. No cameras. Just the quiet weight of everything they'd overcome. Together, they stepped through the glass doors, 2 people once underestimated, now standing tall inside a world they had changed from the inside out. Justice wasn't poetic because it was perfect. It was poetic because it was earned.